Will you dare to walk in the dark silence of street lamps with shadows from muted lights? If so, you might change your opinion once after hearing the untold stories of hidden serial killers. Beneath the colors and noises of India, a dark history remains buried. Are you guys ready to uncover it with us? Mysterious Hook presents you with the top 5 serial killers of India. Let's dive right into the stories of bloodthirsty monsters and cold-blooded psychopaths without any further ado. Number 5. Thug Behram, Yellow Handkerchief Serial Killer. The darkest and quietest hour of India's late 18th century nights became the deadliest nightmare for people. Many knew that travelers who were on the roads during the night disappeared without a trace. But unfortunately, no one was sure what had happened to them. That fear drove travelers to stick together, seeking safety. But that was precisely what the thugs wanted. And no one knows how many people met their end this way. This is the story of the Yellow Handkerchief Serial Killer. Tracing back to the historic roots of serial homicide, roughly between the mid-1600s and the mid-1800s, travelers in India had an unshakable fear. Roads were unsafe, and dacoits reigned supreme across the main provinces of the subcontinent at that time. The poor reputation of the unsafe roads were a driving force in creating an atmosphere of horror and fear among the people for centuries. It was during this time when a shy and silent kid, born in 1765, would turn into one of the biggest threats to the common people in 18th century India, and his name was Behram. A 25-year-old gangster named Saeed Amir Ali had met Behram at some point in his life and trained the kid to become a thug. Behram started to attack and murder people when he was just 10. By the time he himself was 25, he had engaged himself in the world of robberies and assassinations. Behram eventually became the leader of the gangs that murdered and looted the travelers on the roads across the subcontinent. They were a gang of over 200 thugs who worshipped Kali, the Hindu goddess of death. Behram and his companions felt that they had to make sacrifices to please their goddess so that they could prevent the world from being destroyed. Years in the life of crime made Behram and the gang pretty clever in their work. These men would resemble the physical appearance of the traveler, wearing turbans and carrying some luggage. And their idea was to loot a lot without getting caught. Sometimes the gang even used poison that would induce drowsiness, making it easy for them to loot their victims. While they were there in the jungle before attacking the men on the roads, the gang members would communicate by imitating the jackal's cry. They also kept different code languages, including a word called Ramos, which they used before assaulting their victims. Once they determined a person to loot, these men divided themselves into 3 groups. One group would hold the victim's feet down, another group would hold the head down, and the third would do the final murdering. Finally, they would wrap a cloth around the victim's neck and strangle him to death. Now, we mention the victims as a he in particular because the gang avoided murdering women and children. After all, it was a sacrifice to their deity who was a goddess. Now, the moment they robbed the men they had slain, it was no longer for their goddess. It was more to fulfill Thug Behram's unquenchable thirst than for any deity or goddess. So he started to commit murders to quench his own bloodthirst. But wait, how could a yellow handkerchief be the cause of death? Well, Behram was an exceptionally gifted strangler, so his weapon of choice for murdering was a yellow handkerchief. But it doesn't sound too deadly compared to a large knife or gun, does it? Maybe that's why Behram would have turned the handkerchief into a clever murder weapon. Thug Behram employed the same way of murdering his victims almost every single time. He was said to strangle his victims to death using his handkerchief and a medallion. He could throw this medallion around the victim's Adam's apple, which allowed him to strangle people with deadly force. After that, he disposed of the remains in wells. He would have murdered at least 150 people in this manner, but he witnessed many more murders taking place right in front of his eyes. During his initial days of crime, Behram was also accompanied by a female thug named Dolly, but later on, both were separated. Behram gave new meaning to words like brutality, thugs, and notorious. People throughout central India had heard about the disappearances that occurred regularly, and eventually it attracted the attention of the British authorities. They reacted to these unexplained incidents by assigning detectives to find out what was happening. Of course, Behram murdered these detectives, but not before they discovered that a guy named Thug Behram existed. The British didn't expect to find the detectives dead, and so the British sent a man into India who entirely changed the face of gangsterism in the nation, William Henry Sleeman. This man is almost single-handedly responsible for curbing organized crime in 18th century British India. He announced that any thug who agreed to be an informant for them would have been granted immunity. When authorities met people and informed them about this immunity, Sleeman had got a lead about Saeed Amir Ali's location. Finally, the Britishers reached his house, but by then Saeed had escaped from there. But his mother and other family members were arrested by the Britishers promptly. For the sake of his family, in 1832, Saeed Amir Ali surrendered, and after many inquiries, he gave clear information about Behram to the Britishers. After a couple of years, Behram and his gang were finally captured in 1838. After the arrest, Behram revealed that he, along with his group members, had killed nearly 931 victims with the help of yellow handkerchiefs and medallions, of which Behram personally murdered 150. After narrating the stories of his crimes, the other members of his group were also arrested by the Britishers. Finally, in 1838, he was hung at a tree at Jabalpur, Madhya Pradesh. Sleeman gave a concession to Behram's new gang members by sending all of them to the Jabalpur's reformatory. People in central India were so relieved by what transpired afterward that they named a town near Jabalpur after Sleeman, named Sleemanbad. Simply put, Thug Behram's and his people's narrative is yet another tale of human sacrifice taken to an extreme, all in the name of religion. Behram was the leader of the Thuggy cult, which has its name in the Guinness Book of World Records for its 931 victims. Interestingly, all of the gold, silver, and precious stones he stole and buried have not been recovered yet. The location of his priceless loot remains a mystery. Number 4. Raman Raghav, India's Jack the Ripper. Mumbai, also known as Bombay, was the city that never sleeps, but it had once been put to bed early. The slum dwellers and people who didn't hesitate to sleep on the pavement were once made to go into hiding. Bombay police, who captured the underworld by the throat, once fell short of hands to piece this puzzle together. All because there was once a mystified man from Tirunelveli, Tamil Nadu, who had served 5 years in prison for assaulting his sister and stabbing her to death. The man had become a nightmare for people who inhabited the land of dreams and hopes. This is the story of India's Jack the Ripper. Some call him Sindhi Dalway, while a few call him Talway. For some, he was Anna, and for the rest, he was Veluswamy. But his name was Raghav Raman. He was born in 1929 in the Tirunelveli district of Tamil Nadu. He didn't complete his schooling because of indulging in crimes at a young age. However, his crimes didn't stop there. He assaulted his sister and stabbed her to death with multiple knife wounds, for which he served 5 years in prison. After that, nobody knew where Raghav went or where he lived, until he set foot in Bombay. To know his entire story, we need to go back to the times when Mumbai was Bombay. Holding an umbrella in the streets to protect himself from the unpredictable Bombay rains, a well-groomed man with neatly combed hair spreading the faint fragrance of coconut oil appeared a bit obsessive by looking into the mirror that he carried every few minutes. But except for these appearances, Raghav wasn't an ordinary man in Bombay. It happened during the late 60s. The delicate bright mornings in Bombay made people notice the dead bodies that had started piling up in their vicinities, but nobody knew how. It was evident that dwellers near slums, pavement residents, stray animals, or anybody without a suitable home were the potential targets. But no one knew that Raghav did this or that he even existed. Only in the silence of the nights, when the streetlights and suspicions were low, Raghav would come out from the woods to look for anything that moved, so that he would hammer the life out of them. To him, humans weren't humans. They were things that he could smash and crush with blunt objects. He used a regular steel rod to beat human faces, crack their heads, and break their skulls. He also used various handmade weapons to assault as many as 19 people along the Central Railway line between 1965 and 1966. Some were beaten to death, but others lived to tell the terrifying story of a small-statured guy. One such eyewitness who reported the incident to the local police was Kritika. She was a relative of one of the victims. She was the one who gave descriptions of the man who beat his victims to death. And Raghav seemed to be a homeless guy who matched the eyewitness's description. So he was summoned. But owing to a lack of proof, Raghav was deported back to the streets. After that, he wasn't suspected. His murder stopped for a while, but the peace was temporary. When the dead began to pile up again in 1968, the investigators were at a loss for how to put this puzzle together. This time, the displeasure of this unknown murderer was felt by more than a dozen victims. Owing to that, Bombay residents were again placed under lockdown. Rumors began to circulate regarding the serial killer's superhuman abilities, and the nightlife of Bombay was overwhelmed with fear. Around the same time, the case was handed over to the Deputy Commissioner of Police, Ramakant Kulkarni. Ramakant, like the rest of the police department, was confused as he went through the files. Nobody knew where to start or where to conclude their hunt. Therefore, it was impractical and nearly impossible to conduct a citywide search because no one knew who they were searching for. So the citywide search was ruled out. While hunting for leads, DCP Kulkarni began documenting the locations of the murders. They found a followed pattern similar to the 1965-1966 homicides. The victims were frequently hacked to death near the jungle shadows. And before 1965, it was along the Central Railway line near the eastern suburbs. And during 1968, it was in the northern suburbs. This remark attracted Kulkarni's interest, and he began looking through Raghav's papers, suspecting Raghav of being involved in this series of murders. Kulkarni issued a warning to his force to keep an eye out for Raghav and bring him in for interrogation. Sub-Inspector Alex Fialho was one among the cops who were called in and given Raghav's files and records. Neither cops nor the victims believed that this man would put an end to the cold-blooded murders of India's Jack the Ripper. A police manhunt involving 2,000 officers was underway around the city. Every member of the task team was handed a photo of Raghav. They conducted an intense hunt in every nook and corner of the city. His photograph was published in the press and a request for assistance and information. It was a gigantic mission in a massive metropolis, and locating Raghav was a long shot, unless he made a mistake. And that's precisely what he did. When Fialho was waiting at a bus stop in South Bombay, he noticed a person was carrying a wet umbrella. But it was not raining there, which raised the suspicions of the sub-inspector. Fialho didn't know what made him look at the individual, but he found this man in khaki shorts and a long blue shirt, walking in his direction. He asked the man where he was coming from, and he replied Malad, a place in the western suburbs where the murders had happened. It strengthened his doubt since the man was walking in the wrong direction from that place. The man was also carrying half-rimmed spectacles and a thimble that resembled a particular tailor's who was murdered in Malad a couple of days ago. The sub-inspector put the puzzles together, and finally Fialho arrested Raghav in front of a handful of credible witnesses. Raghav's things comprised commonplace objects, including spectacles, 2 combs, a pair of scissors, a stand for lighting incense, soap, garlic, tea dust, and 2 pieces of paper with mathematical figures. His clothing was blood-stained, and his fingerprints matched those on the dead victims. Finally, Raman Raghav was convicted. The police were able to put a face to the 40-plus murders for the first time. Raman's story, however, did not finish there. His confession was as mysterious as the murders that he had carried out. Raman refused to answer any questions for weeks following his arrest. His lips were locked regardless of whether he was being beaten or punished. Out of all the tactics in the book, a chicken dish was the one that made Raman talk. He asked the cops for having the chicken curry after his arrest. After weeks of questioning, the cops decided to agree with his request. After completing his entire chicken curry meal, Raman told the police to ask him whatever questions they wanted. Before the cops knew all they wanted, they had to fulfill a few more wishes though. But finally, Raghav admitted to murdering 41 people. Following his confession, he accompanied the police on a citywide tour to show them the locations where he worked and to retrieve the rod he had hidden in the northern suburbs. Raghav was sentenced to death for his crime, but his defense argued that he was mentally incapable of making conscious judgments and did not realize his actions were illegal. Raghav was referred to a special medical board of 3 psychiatrists by the Bombay High Court due to this. When a panel of doctors examined him at the directive of the High Court, they found that he would never be cured of his kidney failure as well. So the High Court reduced his sentence to life imprisonment in their judgment on August 4th, 1987. He was lodged at Yerwada Central Jail in Pune. He was also under treatment at the Central Institute of Mental Health and Research. In 1995, Raghav died at Sassoon Hospital due to kidney failure. It has been decades since these incidences happened, and yet Raman Raghav remains as India's Jack the Ripper. Number 3. Renuka Shinde and Seema Gavit, the first women in India to receive the death sentence. The story of Renuka Shinde and Seema Gavit is a famous example of how parenting can go drastically wrong, and these 2 sisters gave the term heartless a whole new meaning. This is the story of the first women in India to be hanged for their heinous crimes. A good parent is the one who puts their kids above their own selfish needs and wants. It's not a job, it's a choice. But meet Anhanya Bai, who neither considered parenting a gift nor a responsibility. She was an exceptional mother who ruined the entire lifetime of her daughters, besides destroying many other kids' lives. There wouldn't have been any story about Renuka Shinde and Seema Gavit if Anhana didn't enter the play. Yes, it all began with Anhana. She had no life skills other than pickpocketing and grabbing jewelry in busy areas. It was how she managed to get by for so many years. But one day, this cold-eyed criminal was arrested for 125 petty theft cases, including pickpocketing and snatching people's gold chains from around their necks at railway stations. She said that she had become a thief only after her first husband, a truck driver, deserted her after the birth of Renuka. She then married Mohan Gavit, and they had a daughter, Seema Gavit. But indeed, at a point after their marriage, Mohan became sick of having continual conflict with the cops for petty thievery because Anhana had roughly so many cases filed against her. Mohan hoped that getting Renuka married would at least make Anhana understand her responsibilities. So, in 1989, they married Renuka to Kiran Shinde, who was working as a tailor near Shirdi. But even after Renuka's marriage, Anhana didn't change. Instead, she started to ruin Renuka's life by leading her into petty crimes. Not being able to tolerate Anhana's activities in 1990, Mohan divorced her and left Seema with her. He then got married to a lady named Pratibha. Mohan knew that Anhana was extremely angered because of the marriage, but little did he know about the influence of Anhana over Renuka and Seema. What began as a revenge strategy for Mohan leaving, Anhana quickly turned it into manic kidnappings for her selfish gain. Neither Anhana nor her daughters could forget Mohan leaving them. Though Anhana did these petty crimes for her living, she couldn't let Mohan live a happy life with his wife. So, in November 1996, Anhana, along with her daughters Renuka and Seema, planned to kidnap and murder Mohan's 9-year-old daughter Kranti, and they succeeded in that plan. Mohan and Pratibha reported their kid's disappearance. They both were sure that only Anhana and her daughters could do this to Kranti. The inspectors assigned to the investigation confirmed their suspicions as well. A search team was sent to their house in Nasik. They uncovered evidence of more kidnapping, including discarded clothing of Kranti, confirming that they had murdered her. They also found a mysterious present of several children and photos of Renuka's children's birthday party celebrations. They didn't seem to be locals. Nasik police quickly figured out that the 3 women were a pickpocketing gang, also involved in petty crimes. But who were the children? The investigation of the children's identity led them to find that Kranti wasn't the only one they murdered. Chatur Shringi Temple, a famous religious place in Pune, was where the actual story of Renuka Shinde and Seema Mohan Gavit took a sinister turn. And Renuka's son Sudhir was the catalyst for their initiative in these crimes. It was 1990. One day, the 3 women went with Renuka's son Sudhir to a temple. It was the first time when the trio had gotten into some trouble. Besides being a kid, Sudhir had attempted to pickpocket someone, which turned the eyes of the crowd towards Renuka and Sudhir. But she turned her child into a shield, telling the crowd that a mother with a kid would never steal. These words from the mother made the angry crowd stay calm, and finally the crowd let them go. This incident made Anhana take a child with them whenever the group committed a robbery. Instead of Renuka's kids, they chose newborns and young children from busy areas like temples or marketplaces. Then, when they finished their thefts, or if the infant opened its mouth and made any sound, they would either leave or murder the child. Their first victim was Santosh, who was just 18 months old. Renuka kidnapped him from a female beggar in Kohalpur. The trio took him to Kohalpur and went to a temple. When Seema tried to snatch a wallet and was caught by the male victim, he began beating her. Anhana deliberately threw Santosh to the ground to create a distraction. Unfortunately, the child sustained a head injury due to her monstrous acts. The crowd empathized with the kid's cry and consoled the trio, so their theft went unreported to the police. The trio then moved on to a bus stop and stole 3 more purses with injured Santosh. They didn't even care to offer first aid to the kid. Due to his bleeding head wound, the poor kid continued to cry. Anhana decided the boy was of no further use and might attract the attention of the police. So she mercilessly struck him with an iron pole until he was dead, and then washed her clothes of blood. They took his body to a rickshaw stand and disposed of it, fleeing back to their hostel. This was only the start of their horrible actions. They kidnapped dozens of kids between 1990 and 1996, and then discarded them when they had served their purpose. The majority of them were beaten to death, their skulls smashed in, or thrown down flights of stairs, among other things. In 1991, they kidnapped 9-month-old Naresh, who was starved and beaten to death because he cried too much, while an 18-month-old Bhavna was bundled into a handbag and left in a cinema's restroom. In 1993, the trio abducted a 1-year-old child named Bunty and a 2-year-old girl Swati from Kalyan railway station in Mumbai, and a 2-year-old boy Guru from another Mumbai station. The 3 women murdered Bunty and Guru and disposed of their bodies. In 1994, they kidnapped another 2-year-old kid named Anjali in Nashik. They murdered her and disposed of the body. Kiran, Renuka Shinde's husband, had no other choice than to help the trio dispose of the body. In 1995, they kidnapped a boy named Raja from a bus stop in Kohalpur and murdered him as well. They kidnapped Pankaj Mamankar, age 4. When they found that the boy was talking to the passers-by about his parents, the ladies killed him by hanging him upside down from a ceiling and slamming his skull against a wall. That was in 1996. According to Kiran Shinde, these ladies were ruthless and had no guilt for their actions, and authorities linked the photographs to the slew of kidnappings and murders involving children in Kohalpur, Nashik, and Pune districts to the trio of the sisters and their mother. All of them, including Kiran Shinde, were arrested. Despite this, Kiran received a pardon in exchange for collaborating with the authorities and providing all of the information they needed. Seema Gavit was just 25, and Renuka Shinde was 29 during their arrest in 1996. While Anhana died of sickness shortly after her arrest, the other two were found guilty of murdering 5 children and abducting 13 children. Despite filing a mercy petition in 2014, which India's former president Pranab Mukherjee denied, the sisters are presently on execution row. In reviewing the mercy appeal brought by half-sisters, the Bombay High Court postponed its judgment on December 23, 2021. The Bombay High Court commuted the half-sisters' execution sentence to life imprisonment on January 18, 2022. Number 2. K.D. Kempamma, India's first convicted female serial killer. Over a time period of 3 months, 5 women were discovered dead on the outskirts of Bangalore. There were no marks on their bodies and no sexual or physical violence evidence. Cops were confused until the autopsy entered the play. According to the victim's autopsy report, cyanide was in their system. Who do you suspect committed these assassinations? What may be the reason behind this? Most people imagine a male with wrong reasons as the murderer of these women. But you would be wrong. Yes, this is the story of India's first convicted female serial killer. The mastermind behind the cyanide was K.D. Kempamma, also known as Cyanide Malika. Here's the story of how she got her name. K.D. Kempamma of Karnataka is India's first female serial killer. She is accused of being responsible for the deaths of 6 women in the state of Karnataka between 1998 and 2007. After her first murder, she is thought to have taken a 7-year sabbatical. The fact that a woman murdered these victims astonished the investigating authorities for a long time, thanks to chauvinistic mentalities. This isn't a scary story by any means. Actually, on the contrary, this is a narrative of greed and ambition. It is the story of a humble lady who was so ambitious that nothing could stand in her way, not even human lives. Born in 1970 at Kaglipura, Kempamma and her family lived in the suburbs of Bangalore. They were a simple family leading an everyday life like most other families in the village. Kempamma was always ambitious. She had always been attracted to a more lavish lifestyle. She always thought of pursuing the quickest path to her goals. Her ambitions never changed even after she grew. When she was a teenager, Kempamma married a tailor and became a mother soon after. She had 2 more children after that. However, Kempamma was dissatisfied with life's offerings. She wanted more, and much more. She served as a house helper in the place that she was born, yet her earnings didn't satisfy her. So Kempamma decided to become wealthy overnight and began stealing from the homes where she worked as a helper. Following this, she decided to establish a chit fund near her house to assist her in achieving her objectives, which she finally accomplished. However, as a result, the chit funds experienced significant losses because of Kempamma. This resulted in the family of 5 being buried in debt. Kempamma's husband threw her out of the house in a rage. In 1998, he deserted her. She was forced to search for new sources to create money after losing her business. While she was looking for a source of money, she found cheating ladies in distress to be the easiest. She eventually found work at a jewel shop after working as a helper for a period of time. However, it too did not work out in the end. Her employment at the jewel shop, on the other hand, was not in vain. She also had discovered a one-way ticket to wealth in the shape of cyanide. Kempamma claims that she learned about cyanide and its usage as a poison from the movies that she viewed. However, while cyanide was a copied notion, the remainder of the method was unique. So Kempamma came up with a great murderous plan to get wealthy in only a few days, and her plan was to capture ladies visiting the temple. Every day, Kempamma would visit the temple to keep a closer eye on what was there. She remained focused on the regulars, who appeared to be in a lot of discomfort. When the timing was perfect, she would approach them as holy women and listen to their troubles. She would be well aware of their distress and desires. She would say that she decided to help them out by performing a ritual which would fix all of their issues. She would also ask them to wear their most valuable clothes and jewelry to the ritual. Kempamma would frequently invite them to a temple on the outskirts of town that they had never visited before. After that, she'd ask them to close their eyes and pray. They had no clue that it would be their final blink of the eye. Then she'd bring them holy water, which was cyanide-laced water, and that was her modus operandi for all of her victims. Cyanide Malika's first victim was a 30-year-old rich woman, Mamata Rajan, living on the outskirts of Bengaluru in 1999. After that, Kempamma's attention was pulled to precious goods regularly. In the month of October 2007, Elizabeth became her second victim. Elizabeth was a woman who was on the search for her missing granddaughter. Kempamma called her to Kabalama Temple, performed her ritual, and murdered her. Her third victim was 60-year-old Yashadama, who suffered from asthma. In December of 2007, with the promise of curing the same, Kempamma brought her to Siddhaganga and murdered her. Muniyama was Kempamma's fourth target, who wished to be a devotional singer. Unfortunately, she was murdered at a temple in Yadayur, a short distance from Bangalore. Kempamma's fifth victim, Palama, was a priest at a temple in Habal. Kempamma promised her that she would sponsor the building of a new arch for that temple and murdered Palama at a temple close to Mandya. The sixth and final victim of Cyanide Malika was a poor, childless woman who only wanted a son. Her name was Nagaveni, and she was murdered in her sleep. Kempamma was caught and arrested on December 31, 2008, at a bus stop in an attempt to sell the jewelry that she had taken off of her victims. Unfortunately, many other jewels belonging to her other victims were also found. She was eventually given the death penalty for her murders, which was later commuted to a life sentence. While Kempamma was convicted for the cold-blooded murders of these 6 women, it is believed that she may have killed other women too. This might have included a young woman called Renuka, who wanted to give birth to a son but could not. The profile fit Kempamma's modus operandi, but this was not proven. A few other women had also gone missing, some of whose bodies were found in 2009 and further connected to Kempamma. Her victims were older ladies going through difficult moments in their lives, and Kempamma would take on a new identity after each murder. She was first arrested by Baidati police in 2001 when she tried to rob jewelry from a house where she went to perform a ritual. Kempamma was taken to the interrogation there, but the relatives found her and she was rescued. She, however, was sentenced to 6 months in jail for her crime. As a result, she was released after 6 months of imprisonment. After her first murder, Kempamma was reported to have gone 7 years without getting engaged in another. There are claims that she murdered many people during this period, but this also remains a mystery. She admitted to her crimes when the police arrested her, but this was not the end, as Kempamma was again convicted for multiple murders. She was consecutively given the death sentence in 2010 and 2012 for the murders of Muniyama and Nagaveni respectively, but her punishment for Nagaveni's death was commuted to a life in prison, as only circumstantial evidence was found against her. Kempamma became the first woman to be given the death penalty in Karnataka. In 2017, Kempamma again hit the headlines when she became the jailmate of V.K. Sashikala, a confidant of late Supremo J. Jayalalitha. It was alleged that Kempamma tried to meet Sashikala several times, due to which she was shifted to another jail, as she posed a threat to Sashikala. Malika's cyanide is still a mystery, although we sometimes try to rationalize murders by looking back in time to identify anything that went horrifically wrong during the killer's formative years. Cyanide Malika's early life provides no such clues, as there is little to no information about that period. The circumstances surrounding the killings, on the other hand, lead us to think that she was motivated entirely by financial gain. However, Cyanide Malika remains to be India's first convicted female serial killer. Number 1. Amarjeet Sada, the world's youngest serial killer. No matter how many different types of serial killers there are, it is unbelievable that an 8-year-old child would get addicted to murder and pleasure. Psychologists and sociologists continue to be amazed by this little boy from Bihar. He murdered 3 children, one by one, without guilt at such a young age. But on the contrary, he threw an innocent smile whenever the cops asked him about the murder. Here is the story of the world's youngest serial killer. What precisely did that Bihari kid do? Well, unfortunately, we'll have to travel back to over a decade to find out. Amarjeet, born in 1996, had already committed 3 murders at the age of 8. Born in the village of Mushahar, Bihar, the kid experienced a childhood much like other children around him. However, none of the people around him knew that he would commit such heinous crimes. Some people speculate that as his father was a laborer, he forced Amarjeet to work from a very early age. Considering that the family was poor, abuse must have taken place that led to the nurturing of Amarjeet's psychopathic and sadistic tendencies. Amarjeet seemed to find joy in picking out victims he had easy access to, and would strangle them to death. What is more horrific is that the families and the villagers knew about the murders that Amarjeet had been committing, but chose to remain silent, deeming them as internal familial issues. As a result, they didn't realize that Amarjeet's killing spree would soon show its marks outside of his family, and his cousin Khushbu was among one of his victims. Amarjeet's distant aunt, Chanchan Devi, said she had left her daughter Khushbu to sleep at her village primary school while attending household chores and returned to find that she had disappeared. After the news spread, people started to fear the worst, and knowing about Amarjeet's past and his easy access to Khushbu, they confronted him. When villagers confronted Amarjeet, he alleged to have confessed to the murder, leading them to where he had attempted to conceal the body in a shallow grave. After his arrest, police said the boy had then confessed to the murder of his 8-month-old sister 3 months ago, and his 6-month-old cousin, the daughter of a maternal uncle almost a year ago. As he was being questioned, Amarjeet showed no guilt and cheerfully told the villagers about he strangled the child to death and led them to the shallow grave where she was buried. Excitedly, he told them, "I killed her by beating her using a brick." He told them that he quickly covered her remains in the grass around the area and left for his house after she was dead. After confessing, Amarjeet was arrested for the murder of Khushbu Devi. Unfortunately, because his first 2 victims' murders were covered up by his family, he was never proven guilty. Despite this, he was interrogated and asked questions about how and why he assaulted his victims. His response would send shivers down anyone. Yet Amarjeet Sada merely smiled at the officers and asked for more biscuits when confronted about the deaths. He showed no guilt, and if he was pointed in the direction of his horrible actions, he would stop talking and grin. As it became evident that this was a clear example of child psychopathy, the superintendent Amir Lodha ordered that Amarjeet's case should be investigated from a psychiatric standpoint. Soon after, Shamshad Hussain, a Patna-based psychotherapist, investigated Amarjeet's case, concluding that this was a case of a youngster who lacked apparent guilt and had a great passion for inflicting pain on others. And he also said that it was a concrete example of psychopathy. Amarjeet appeared to have a brain abnormality that caused a chemical imbalance, leading to enhanced enjoyment from inflicting harm on others. In addition, he was diagnosed with a hereditary behavior disorder that caused him to commit acts of violence since he had no sense of right or wrong. Finally, Amarjeet was prosecuted as a juvenile, and it is believed that under Indian law, he was sentenced to only 3 years in juvenile jail, as no kid may be condemned to more than that. He was sent to a mental health care center after serving his sentence because of his mental state and the grave threat that he posed to society. The whereabouts of Amarjeet Sada remain unknown. However, in 2015, he contacted the Post-Mortem Post and claimed to be at a children's facility in India, where he was meant to reside until he became 18 years old. Amarjeet Sada is about 26 years old now. He is expected to be living a new life under a new identity. No one knows where he is or what he does. We can hope that he has received the treatment he needs and can live life like an average person by staying at the remand home. While it's unclear whether he'll commit more crimes or if his child psychopathy was treated at the time of his conviction, it is safe to assume that Amarjeet Sada's case is unique and that it involved not only premeditated infant murders, but also elaborate plans to hide their bodies so that he wouldn't be caught. It's terrifying to think that an 8-year-old child did this. Some argued that Amarjeet was not the original perpetrator and was framed for the murders, since the magnitude of the crime and the complex nature of the body hideouts could not have been committed by an 8-year-old child. Now, this argument has some credibility since no examples of psychotic youngsters who not only killed their victims but also went to tremendous measures to conceal the corpse and evidence have been documented. Despite this plausible conspiracy theory, the fact that he was very excited to show the bodies and knew precisely where they were, as well as his smile when asked about the murders, seems to point us in the direction of Amarjeet Sada being India's and the world's youngest and most infamous serial killer. When it comes to psychopaths and serial killers, people often assume that their murderous urge was programmed into their brains from birth. And these serial killers proved that statement right. These are the story of the top 5 serial killers who left their names in the black letters of Indian history. How did you feel after hearing about these killers? Let us talk about it in the comments section. Also, if you'd like to see similar cases, please tune in to our new videos at Mysterious 7. We will be back with a new case soon. Thank you for watching our video, but before you leave, offer us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Then hit the bell button to get notified about our new exciting cases.